residential schools that were sanctioned by the Canadian government as well as the Catholic Church. We really urge you to read the report from Kamloops that came out yesterday. And we stand with all Indigenous communities in demanding that the church and the government release their records and release any records that are asked of them. So I'm just going to start with a quick overview of our presentation today. I'm going to quickly tell you about the history of our project, why we started doing it and when. And then Christa will speak to what makes our project unique, which is in part the collaboration that we have in archival studies with our colleagues in social work. And then I will move into a quick sneak peek of our data. We don't have a lot, but it's already really very interesting. And then we'll let you know what our next steps are in terms of the project. So the project that we're talking about to you today has its roots in 2019 when Wendy, myself, and a colleague, Megan Shields, who was an MI student at the time at U of T, we wanted to test the waters and see if a bigger project of this scale would be possible. We had all had experiences, Wendy, myself, and Megan, working with difficult records that brought up difficult emotions. And so we were all very invested in participating in this sort of community of research that's going on around emotions in archives, including, of course, all the amazing work by Jennifer Douglas. So we sent out a survey in 2019 that asked archivists to reflect on their emotional experiences in the archive, both good and bad. It was important to us that we cover a range of such emotions. And we are now in the process of finishing up the article that's based on those preliminary findings. And in that article, we introduce the concept of activist potentialities, following Anna Sexton's use of traumatic potentialities, which we first heard, I think, back at AERI in 2019 in a panel that we had together. So for us, activist potentialities refers to the idea that archivists actively make choices about how they undertake their work, and that these choices are often based on emotional reactions to records and people that they're working with. So some of the choices that were reflected in our survey were things like slowing down to read records more carefully, to write very detailed descriptions, content warnings, sometimes preserving records that are important from scheduled destruction. And so hopefully the article will be available soon-ish, and we'll be so happy to have all of your feedback on that. And our current project, which is funded by Shirk Insight Grant, it expands on that preliminary work. And so we have 4 objectives, which you can see here on the slide. I'm not going to read them all, but just to give you a sort of highlight. First, we wanted to better understand the nature of and the factors that are associated with emotional responses of archivists. We want to identify the way that institutions support or fail to support archivists in that work. And importantly to us, we want to develop a theoretical model that's specific to the archival profession to understand what these emotional responses do and what we can do about them. So that's part of the reason that we asked to collaborate with our amazing colleagues in social work. And then the 4th thing we want to do is to really build tools, educational materials based on our findings. So look, we've seen some of that in the last week of AERI presentations. We've seen how much work is being done, and I'd probably say especially in Australia, from developing courses and protocols and sheets. So we want to contribute to that work. We're mostly focused on Canada, and so we hope that this perspective is going to enrich the body of work that's already going on. So I will turn this to Christa.
Hey everyone. So thanks, Henria, for sharing a bit about the history of the project. I will be speaking to the unique aspects of this project and the contributions of social work to this area. So not surprisingly, one of the unique aspects and strengths of our project is that it involves an interdisciplinary collaboration between the faculties of information and social work. So I want to begin coming in with humility and recognizing that I'm not from the archives, but sharing some thoughts about broadly what the profession of social work brings. So while emotions, trauma, and archives is a relatively new area of study, albeit a growing area as evidenced by the presentations and wonderful work that's already being done, social work and social sciences in general have already established a strong scholarship in the area of trauma that contends with issues related to theories and conceptualizations, evidence-based interventions, and research on exposures to trauma and trauma-related impacts, as well as the application of trauma-informed care and practices in working with those who are directly and indirectly impacted by trauma. So a salient example is the work of Cheryl Rugger, who is also a PI on this project, and her work in relation to exposure to traumatic stressors in the workplace, working with first responders like police, paramedics, also child welfare workers and mental health workers. And then just speaking broadly about social work, from the undergraduate level, we adopt a generalist approach, which kind of means that we're building our knowledge and skill set to work with diverse populations across the lifespan, or as we often say, like from cradle to grave before we specialize in a particular area. So already we're equipped to kind of work across different diverse populations. And our profession is known for situating person in an environment, which is a social ecological lens that recognizes individuals' influence and are influenced by different social, political, economic, and cultural contexts at levels from the micro to the macro level. So I'm thinking more specifically about how social work relates to trauma and archives. I think there are related dialogues or conversations that we've had in our discipline that relate to some of the issues being discussed by archivists and archival scholars. For example, discussions about thinking beyond trauma through a medicalized lens that can be pathologizing, but to understand it through multiple lenses, to recognize trauma in context. In essence, that trauma can also be experienced as a social and a cultural phenomenon. So it's not a question of which trauma is worse, as if direct, vicarious, secondary trauma exists on a hierarchy, but recognizing that that impact of trauma is real and needs to be addressed as serious and done compassionately. And I think that in I think about how in social work we often say that we do our work, in order to do our work effectively or help others, we also need to simultaneously be tending to our own physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual health and well-being and needs. And the last point I want to stress that kind of transitions us to our interdisciplinary collaborative work is that each of our disciplines, archives and social work, has its own expertise that it brings to the table. And we're bridging and building that knowledge through sharing and collaboration in this area where there are intersections and overlap. So with that said, I was hoping to spend a few minutes just sharing some reflections about what it's been like to work on this interdisciplinary team to showcase how our collaborations have translated into our research process and practices in unique ways, focusing particularly on the interviews that we're doing. And Henria, feel free to jump in as well if you have things you want to share. But I think as a social worker, some of these skills have become kind of second nature. And so it's been rewarding to be able to reflect on what I'm bringing through the conversations with those outside the profession. So from the beginning, our team kind of made a conscious decision that there would be two interviewers doing the interviews, each with their respective backgrounds and experiences, and recognizing that we're paying attention to different aspects in the interview. So I think as we were doing our interviews, we would have one lead interviewer, but we would also create opportunities for the other interviewer to ask questions that maybe I, as a social worker, would not be attuned to. Whereas on the flip side, in the interviews of Henria, there are aspects that I would be maybe paying attention to in terms of coping and like the symptoms or how people, what manifests in terms of how people are responding to emotions, the emotions in that. Sorry. And even before the interview begins, I think there's been quite a few conversations that and preparation work that Henria and I do in advance to help be attuned to where individuals are at, if they're having anxieties or fears about talking about this work, talking about, specific incidences that occur within their work. So we already, before even starting the interview, are establishing rapport and building that relationship within a short time frame. I think that really makes a difference and also in recognizing the vulnerability of risk of those who are being interviewed, just being open to sharing about who we are and our relationship to the work in terms of what social work says is our professional use of self. And I know that I'm just mindful of time. So the two more points that I want to make is that we really invite participants to kind of lead the interview and share at their pace in terms of how they're making sense of their experiences. And we really see ourselves kind of guiding those conversations where through certain questions and giving them control of how much or how little they would like to share. And I think that's a form of kind of mitigating some of those power dynamics that exist between, researcher and validating their experiences and also empowering them in a way where they're able to speak to their experiences and make sense of it in their own words. And then finally, I just want to say too that another piece we've done is after the interviews, really taking that time to debrief and support each other and recognizing that there's a lot of sensitive content or emotion so that can be evoked even in doing the interviews themselves. So we really try to support each other as a team and tend to our own emotions and our own health and well-being. And I'll leave it at that and turn it back over to Henria.
I'll just add that I feel like yesterday I was also talking about interdisciplinary collaborations between archival studies and South Asia studies. And, thinking now about that and listening to Christa, I've learned so much from my collaboration with Christa, so much. And things that will really help me during my field work, things that I don't, I've read a lot of how to interview guides, and there's something sort of, it seems innate in you, Christa. And I know that it's through some like work and training and that you've been doing interviews for a long time, as well as just being a generally wonderful and sensitive person. And so again, I have to say that interdisciplinary collaboration, I'm seeing in multiple ways could be really valuable for us in archival studies. And having said that, let's see. Yes, so we're going to give you a really quick sort of peek at what we've been hearing in our interviews. So the first one I have here is that you never know what's going to come your way. The sorts of questions that came up in the interviews, things like how do you prepare yourself when you don't know what records will be put on your desk next? How can you prepare yourself to open a file and find something you don't want to see or read about? Those aren't questions that we asked, but those are the sort of questions that were posed by the people that we interviewed. So for instance, one of our participants talked about being a reference archivist before the pandemic. And she talked about the fear of not knowing what she would be looking at next because her work depended, of course, on users and what they wanted to access. And so in her case, the question was also, how can you learn to handle difficult situations like users believing that the archive is keeping records from them on purpose? So that was an important theme from the interviews. Another participant told us that it's really one thing to work with a group of records, but it's another entirely to think about all of the holdings that you could potentially work with. Because then you get that a sort of anticipation that your next collection might be really difficult. We had several points on education and training. Both the participants that we did these long form interviews with basically said that they felt archivists were not properly trained to start their jobs. They were sort of quote unquote thrown into the deep end, which ends up forcing other archivists to train them as well as doing their work. But there was also a clear sense of empathy for those people. So our interviewees really focus on the fact that they would mentor these new archivists, make them understand how the archive works and what kinds of collections they might be working with. And it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of empathy, but it's necessary because, as they were saying, there's just not enough training in I schools, on my programs, archival studies programs. The third thing we saw was about perspective. Both of the people that we spoke to really talked about how their work changed their perspective at one point or another. So one interviewee shared that when her interactions with users became slightly frustrating, she would think about her own parents who speak English as a second language. And that enabled her to sort of bring an empathy into a situation that otherwise might be more difficult, challenging, and frustrating. And another participant told us that her work with donors her work with donors generally made her, it changed her perspective because it made her realize how intimate archival work can be. And she told us that this completely changed her perspective on archivists and what they do entirely. And so to speak a little bit more on donors, and that's something we've heard a lot about this week, some great presentations at AERI. Donor relations is really central to some of the things that we heard during the interviews. Participant reflected that when you go to someone's house to see their records, emotional connections are likely to form. Almost sure to form. And she realized at this point in her own work that actually relationships with donors are incredibly delicate and personal, which means that she felt even more motivated to do right by the donor. And of course, one particular challenge is that many donors only seek to preserve their records when they're at a turning point in their life, sometimes at the end of their life. And so working with those kinds of complexities, which is not really a part of the archival training curriculum, unsurprisingly, was something that had to be learned just on the go. And then finally, I know that we're running out of time. A sense of duty was a really big thing that we heard in the interviews and that we heard in our preliminary project as well. The question is really, what does duty mean for archivists? How do they define it? One of the interviews struggled with processing tens of thousands of records about a Canadian tragedy without proper staffing or preparation. But she said to us, it just had to be done. It was court ordered. It was a legal issue. They only had a certain amount of time to do it. And so her response was to just, she quote unquote did what she had to do. She put blinders on. She described the documents as sensitively as possible because that was her duty. That was her responsibility as an archivist. So yes, those are just some brief points. And I know these are things that we hear a lot in the research community. So just really emphasizing that these things are still coming up in our context. And then I will tell you quickly about our next steps. We are still in phase 1 of the program because of COVID. So we're still doing interviews, and we eventually hope to have some of those interviews who are interested holding diaries for about 6 months so we can get a better sense of their everyday experience with emotions and archives. Phase 2 will be with Canadian archival institutions. We plan on sending a survey as well as doing interviews with people at the head of these institutions. And finally, we will eventually throughout this, develop a grounded theory model, as well as preparing those educational documents. And the theory model, as I said earlier, it's really meant for to be specific to our field, which we don't have. Maybe it's in process, but we still often compare ourselves to other fields and try to use models that were not designed specifically for us. So I'm sorry that this was kind of over time. You can contact us at these emails. We also have a website. I will put the link in the chat because I don't think it's up here, but this is the photograph of what the front of the website looks like. Okay, thank you so much. And I'm really sorry again about the timing.
Thank you so much, Henria and Christa, for such an insightful presentation. Our next presenter is Bethany Radcliffe, University of Michigan, and her presentation is titled Expanding Creatorship, Archival Affect, and Network Creation. Take it away, Bethany.
Hi, everyone. Let me share my screen really quickly. Awesome. Can you see my slides? Awesome. So this is research that I did on my own. So let me introduce myself. My name is Bethany Radcliffe. I recently graduated from the University of Texas at Austin with an MA in English and a Master's of Science and Information Studies. And I'm an incoming PhD student at the University of Michigan School of Information, where I will be working with Beth Yakel and Libby Hemphill. And I'm going to do a quick land acknowledgement and just say that I am zooming into you from Austin, Texas. The Tonkawa lived in Central Texas, and the Comanche and Apache moved through this area. And I want to acknowledge that this is unceded Indigenous land and that there are still Indigenous people living and visiting Austin, Texas. So overall with this work, it was part of my master's report. So this isn't funded. This is just some it's a paper that I wrote to graduate that I feel very excited about and want to potentially publish sections from or expand upon something and build into that a little bit more. But overall in this paper, I am talking about and suggesting that like the previous presentation, a broader understanding of archival work of the archivist as effective could lead to a more transparent understanding of archival work as that which is creative and exists in a network of co-creators, including the archivist, who has a major role in the way that collections are represented. I'm really interested in the way affect and creatorship connect and how this adds value to the labor and decision-making that the archivist goes through. And really what I'm suggesting is that the archivist is a creator of sorts alongside the named creator of the collection in a certain way. I'll also say that I kind of got to this topic because I was working and still am at the Harry Ransom Center. I work in public services, but I was working on a project on the side enriching descriptive metadata in our sound collections database. In doing so, I came across some content and descriptions in a few collections, one being the John Beecher sound recordings collection that I'll talk about in a second, that were very intimate and personal. I couldn't tell what part was maybe a label that came with the recording and what was written by an archivist or multiple archivists. And clearly I was seeing these levels of creatorship and co-creatorship and how this archival description was existing in the world. And this got me thinking more about the archivist's exposure to these sensitive materials and the affect there and how that contributes to the archivist's real ability to shape the way collections are perceived and of course eventually shape memory. Something else I'll talk about a little bit later is that I also think archival neutrality is kind of related to this in a sense that some archivists still hold to ideas of neutrality, even though in theoretical discourse and recent studies and work, we see that archives are very much not neutral and that the archivist has this creative freedom. So later on, when I talk about the research I did interviewing archivists, I will address that a little bit more. So at the Harry Ransom Center, I first spoke, before I even thought about doing like more of a study, I spoke with Christine Bethke, who's an archivist there, and she was processing a collection made up of materials from a literary and political couple, social activists, and even poets, John and Barbara Beecher. And she noticed that this collection, according to the contract, according to the accession records, was called the John Beecher Collection. John Beecher also was the great-great-nephew of Harriet Beecher Stowe and Henry Ward Beecher. While processing this collection, the archivist realized that a large part of this collection comprised material from Barbara Beecher, who was also an archivist and printmaker. And further, Barbara Beecher created and left notes on context and meaning of items in the collection throughout. because of this realization and feeling kind of moved at noticing these materials in the collection, the archivist petitioned for the collection to be renamed to include both creators, John and Barbara. And after an evaluation process, bringing it to her supervisors, the Harry Ransom Center agreed to rename the collection the John and Barbara Beecher Collection. And I kind of show this example of kind of a small decision, but an anecdote that shows the lack of nuance in how the archival profession considers creatorship in archives, and of the hidden labor and creation of the archivist herself, who, as she sort of attuned herself to this archive, was able to advocate for change. And I think this contributes to the ongoing way that the archival profession, scholars, students, and then the public perceive and understand this collection. And this is just one example. So I wanted to talk a little bit about affect, and I think I'm speaking to a crowd that's very familiar with it. But in the past few decades, many disciplines, including literature, media studies, psychology, social sciences, gender studies, archives, and more, have really begun to consider this affect theory. And this affective movement in theory really makes a space for taking a closer look at feelings, emotions, empathy within theoretical discourse. Basically, feelings become a valid space of inquiry. And I think through this inquiry, we can kind of ask questions about power, feelings, emotions, uncertainty, and of course, our institutions. I personally think affect is very hard to describe and conceptualize. And that's why I like this definition from Marika C4, who describes affect as, quote, a force that is, quote, unruly, and, quote, deeply implicated in how we live, form subjectivities, connect and disconnect, desire, take action, and practice difference, identity, and community, end quote. She notes that, like archives themselves, affect has the power to create and impact relationships between, quote, people and records, ideologies, institutions, networks, systems, and worlds. In my opinion, this definition of affect is one that is messy, real, and human, which is often disregarded in some of the typical standardized, authoritative archival narratives. Let me go to the next slide. So as the last presentation kind of talked about, there's kind of this affect gap from considering the archivist as someone being implicated in the impact of affect. In my humanities discourse, this Arlette Farge's work, Allure of the Archives, often came up. And Arlette Farge talks about this certain pull that archival institutions, documents, places have as it relates to the researcher and the historian. But the archivist is never really considered in this. I bring up another work by C4, and this time Anne Gilliland, where they talk about how the archival field has begun to take affect into consideration. And they kind of leave with this closing question: what kinds of affect are experienced by the archivist? And so I'm going to move into a section where I kind of get a little more theoretical before I talk about the archivist that I talk to. So bear with me. Something that kept coming up and I kept finding myself drawn to in my kind of like English side of my discourse while I was taking more archival library courses was feminist new materialist theory. And I think Donna Haraway is kind of like the mascot of this, as well as Jane Bennett and Karen Barad. And this theory, I'm not going to go too in depth and for the sake of time, but I think that it's closely related to affect because both approaches are ontological in nature and have to do with the way that individuals, including humans, matter, the earth, and things interact and relate to each other and then define themselves and make meaning. So coming from that, I became really interested in this book that's very much grounded in that discourse by Kathleen Stewart, who is an anthropologist at the University of Texas. Her book is called Ordinary Affects. And the focus of this book is on the way that everyday affective moments, everyday interactions that are effective in nature, these can be sometimes intangible, sometimes brilliantly impactful, joyful, not joyful, how these create meaning and kind of are how we exist in the world and go through life making meaning. She describes affects. She says affects are not so much forms of signification or units of knowledge as they are expressions of ideas or problems performed as a kind of involuntary and powerful learning and participation, particularly with ordinary affects, which is the term that I focused on in this work. Stewart says the varied surging capacities to affect and to be affected that give everyday life the quality of continual motion of relations, scenes, contingencies, and emergences are ordinary affects. So these everyday moments that really shape how we exist in the world. I'm going to go back to the anecdote I spoke about earlier with the archivist at the Ransom Center, Christine Bethke. And this is a picture of a screenshot of the sound recordings collection. And basically, I think every little decision is important in the archival context, and that's kind of what ordinary affects helps me think about. And at the Ransom Center, collections are separated when they're like accessioned. And so the main archivist processing a collection of papers is probably not the one who processes the audio materials. And as such, Christine's change and petition to change the name of the collection of papers didn't make it to the public-facing collection of audio that was digitized. After speaking with Christine and other archivists, that is going to be changed soon, but you probably can't read it on your screen, but in this last paragraph, the paragraph talks about how Barbara Beecher was the one who recorded everything and knew how to use the reel-to-reel machine and often interviewed people. So she's just as much a creator here as she is in the other collection. So I'm going to move to what is kind of my final chapter of my master's report that I wrote, which after talking with that one archivist, Christine, at the Ransom Center, I was inspired to kind of extend my work and talk with more archivists and a pretty informal kind of study about experiences of emotion and affect and how they become part of the creative decision-making process. So I talked again to Christine with the same semi-structured interview that I also interviewed 5 other anonymous archivists with. I had a couple archivists who asked to be anonymous, so I just made them all anonymous. And the questions that I created, I will put some of them up. I'm not going to read through all of these, but basically I asked questions to learn about the collections the archivists processed, how they were affected and impacted by these, what stuck out to them in collection work, what was challenging, what material was impactful, what like still sits with you even years later. And even what were easy decisions, what were things that like you do so routinely that you don't even think about. And then I asked them also if they felt like they had a way to communicate impactful moments, and if they viewed their work as neutral or creative. So that was what I spoke about earlier. I was really curious to see, like in theory, we know that like archives are not ever neutral, but I wanted to see how archivists at different institutions conceptualize this. And then I did some light tagging and coding using grounded theory methods in order to kind of end up with a few categories of responses. So the first kind of category, and I based these on the elements of my paper that I had kind of delved into before, which influenced the questions that I set up for the archivists in our interviews. And I talked to them over Zoom for about 45 minutes to an hour and 15 minutes each. And so it was really interesting to see what these different results were. And the affective experiences, what I was calling ordinary affects, were definitely woven through the entire conversations, and they were very challenging to categorize. But what stood out to me was that the working with collections for every archivist was something that was meaningful on a very personal level. I got very like personal stories about struggles with anxiety and depression and encountering traumatic materials. And this idea of effective advocacy came up in a few areas where archivists really felt the need to do what you see in the final part, which is where one archivist mentioned that she sees her work as empathy work. And she said balancing seeing people on their best and worst days. So really working through collections in order to figure out how do I need to give an honest depiction of who this individual is. Lots of emotional connections through description work that sometimes led creators to write more detailed descriptions about or archivists about a creator that they felt closer to. I'm going to move to the next slide. So another thing I was thinking of was this kind of co-creatorship or layers or networked creation. And so a lot of what came up was a struggle for the archivist herself to kind of deal with the levels of interactions that are happening on a collection. So the estate, the institution itself, various agencies, curators, other staff, donors. There were lots of influences that the archivist had to sort of sort through in order to assert her own choice in how this collection is described. Archivists talked about decision-making when encountering sensitive and traumatic material. Do I describe this? Do I include this? Do I reach out and let this person know that this is here? Do I see if they're still alive? Things like that. One archivist mentioned that she attempts to avoid inflammatory description in order to like not have controversial things come up. And then one archivist mentioned a decision to protect the privacy of people mentioned in collections. And the next slide. So then understandings of creativity and neutrality. So I was just interested in this because I believe that like subjective versus objective plays into this like acceptance of the effective nature of archival work. And I noticed that creativity for these archivists often manifested itself as deciding if materials need to be, in one example, rehoused or will actually appear on the shelf for people to request online. So almost like deciding on the speed of processing was a big place where archivists asserted their creativity. One archivist said, quote, she feels the need to make choices that are responsible for everyone and not just what is good for the institution. Another archivist shared that she was trained under the auspices of neutrality and letting the records tell their own story. But in recent years, she's understood the power she has to shape collections herself. And a few more things in this area. One archivist told me that she represents things neutrally and that she doesn't like the feeling of having to present things negatively or positively. But she added there is a fair amount of latitude in describing materials, and sometimes she gives more context or explains something further when necessary. Another archivist said she's never seen her role as an archivist as creative, but she does consider it a craft and something that she has really like worked to refine. And then one archivist said that she worried that her lack of creativity and that, quote, the opportunity to express creativity can be limited, specifically when it gets down to the really technical things. So I know I only have a few more minutes, so I'm going to kind of skim through these last few things. So something that I kind of posed in my conclusion is like, what could be potential solutions or potential like ways to make progress in making, like embracing this effective and creative archival work of the archivist. So I think one thing I talk about is archival care, cited from C4 and Caswell, and this idea of a feminist ethics of care being more broadly applied to archival work. And then Jennifer Douglas et al., spelled that wrong, but the idea of grief work was super impactful to my kind of solution or potential solutions, thinking about how this lens of grief work, I connected to what one of my archivists had told me as empathy work, and just realizing that there's a certain creative potential in the way that we use our emotions, or the archivist uses their emotions and their experiences to form the archive. And then something else I was thinking is just an openness about the archivist decisions. Could we include unknowns, suppositions, commentary, questions somewhere in the archival record that's public? And then the last little solution, one thing that I was thinking about is methods like linked data. They serve to complicate creatorship. Ruth Kitchen-Tillman talks about linked data as that which undermines and expands ideas of authority. Anyone can create a record, and people can publish them, so that breaks down typical notions of creatorship. And then reimagining access systems and finding aids as something that's more like much less authoritative, more ongoing, fluid, subjective, like storytelling. And I cited Wendy, Duff, and Vern Harris from 2002 as an example of this like fluidity of descriptive work. And then the idea that from Elizabeth Yackel, that archival representations, the archive and the way it's described is just one of many possible representations. And then finally, just one example. So I was really drawn to Mukurtu's community records feature, and Mukurtu is a content management system, so not exactly a finding aid, but it was developed with Indigenous communities in mind, and it has very thoughtful features and infrastructure that serve to break down and draw awareness to archival authority. Their community records feature deconstructs record creation and invites a very visible layer of co-creatorship. It's not just a static finding aid. In this screenshot, it's actually from the Plateau People's web portal. And you can maybe see it's very tiny and kind of blurry, but there are 4 different versions of the record's metadata and description. So one is from the holding institution, and the other 3 are from 2 from the Umatia community members and 1 from the Yakima community members. And each record includes totally different descriptive metadata and even features for interaction on the page. And then just to end, my concluding thoughts on this are that considering more expansive and inclusive ways to make archival collections accessible and more transparent only expands the value of archival material and makes collections more findable and more reflective of reality, which will then make them more approachable to researchers and anyone else who may access this material for future knowledge. I think it's really important that making empathetic archival care a default part of archival training, because this could put protocol in place for better encountering and handling traumatic and sensitive information. And then I think just recognizing the co-creative nature of an effective labor of the archivist imagines archival work that's more human, more fluid, more diverse, and more real. And so sorry to go over time, and that is all. And I will put my contact info up, bethrad@umich.edu, and my Twitter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bethany. It was super interesting presentation. It's really heartening to see, as an AERI old timer, it's really heartening to see a lot of the sort of ideas and sort of work that was germinated and workshopped at AERI, presented at AERI over several years, sort of come to fruition in the work of other students who are coming to AERI. So I think that's really fantastic. So we have about 12 minutes for a Q&A. So please feel free, if you have a burning question for one of our panelists, for all of our panelists, please feel free to unmute yourself or put yourself on camera, depending. We're a small intimate group, so we could have a really wonderful discussion. So are there any takers? I have a couple of questions myself, but please feel free to supersede my questioning. I'm merely here as a vessel, a conduit facilitation. So any questions? It always feels like you're speaking to the void when you're in Zoom.
I would be oh, Victoria has a question.
Oh, I do have a question. Thank you so much, Victoria. If you could recommend one reading or concept to include in archival education, what would it be? And I assume this would be about affect and emotion and from your presentations. So please, any of our panelists.
I mean, I could go first and say, I mean, this isn't particular to affect and some of the things that I quoted, but it's the reading that got me thinking about breaking down authority in archives, which I think led me to thinking about affect. And that was my advisor, now Beth Yakel's Archival Representations article. And I didn't actually read that in a class, I just stumbled upon it. And I think anytime I ever teach, that's going to be one of the first things I assign, because it really was a light bulb moment for me and it led me down this path. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Bethany. Our other panelists, any burning wrecks?
Well, I can speak to that. Personally, finding Jennifer Douglas's work, even before I started the PhD, was hugely impactful. And in terms of her more recent work that Jennifer has done in with research assistants as well, article on grief work, and generally her work that has been contributing to the sort of person-centered theory that that we're now talking about. So those more recent articles really have been amazing for me. But I also want to say, because in the spirit of interdisciplinary work, there's really good stuff about archives and affect that's not written by archivists, and that in itself is not that great, but I read them for my exams, and I had Wendy, my advisor, reading them with me, and there's some really amazing stuff. So because a lot of my work is about disappearances in Sri Lanka, I would say some of the best work that I've read is, well, I'll type it in the chat also, but author Zia has a whole book called Documenting Resistance, with a chapter 6 on files and archives of the disappeared that we both, and Wendy, I'm speaking for you, but we were both really impacted by that really rich, amazing work.
Thank you so much. Christa, did you have anything you want to add? Did you step away, Christa? One of the Zoom step aways, I do it all the time. So Jennifer Douglas is in the audience, so her cheeks must be burning, her ears must be burning, and she must be very proud of the fact that her work it continues to be so impactful in many ways. Other questions from the audience? I had a question, actually, since there's a little bit of silence. We have about 9 minutes left as well. I was really interested in hearing further from the Toronto team about sort of how generative their sort of interdisciplinary collaboration was, because I'm sure there were moments where, like, the social work folks were like, I can't believe you're saying that about affect. And then you're just like, saying you don't understand what affect means in archives. So you mentioned it briefly, Henria, during your presentation. So I was wondering if I could hear a little bit more about that and sort of what, I don't know, what sort of things you found like didn't sort of, didn't jive or didn't sort of sync in certain ways.
Yeah, it's funny that you ask it in that way, because I think, well, in part, we got really lucky. Again, I'm Christa speaking on your behalf, but we've never met in person because this started during COVID. I think we got along very well personally, so that was helpful. And I think after a couple of meetings with the rest of the team, with Wendy and the other PI, Cheryl, she and I started talking and doing work together every Wednesdays and Fridays. And from that, we sort of realized that we were both looking to do and doing very political work, that we're not interested in doing work that is not political. And so I think that was also a bonding moment for us, that we really were on the same page, and it wasn't just personally, it was also in our work and our professions. And you know what, I don't think we ever really had any issues, partly because we respect each other's knowledge on either sides. We know our own limitations. And it's really wonderful. And I have to say that Wendy really helped us with that as well, because she's really, well, Christa just messaged me that her internet cut out. So
Oh no,
come back.
lost Christa. Thank you for letting us know.
Yeah, yeah. So we, I think that we got lucky, and having a good PI that makes room for everybody's work and ideas was also really helpful.
Yeah, I find it really interesting because, like, of course, I'm sure, like, you know, understandings of affect and its application in different disciplines is different. And, you know, obviously there would be some disagreements, but I was really sort of heartened to hear that it was a very generative collaboration for you guys. And so it helped sort of produce a more robust conceptualization of affect and its application in archives, right? Or it's how it lives in archives. Bethany, I was wondering, like, in your interviews, like, you know, as you know, as you were saying during your presentation, as many of us in the audience, you know, talk about that, at least in a theoretical setting and sort of amongst a certain sector of archivists and archival theorists, like, you know, the concept of neutrality is like, oh, please, that's so like 20, 30 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. So why do you feel that some people still hold on to it amongst your interviewees? Like, why were they asserting that constantly?
Yeah, so it was really interesting when I posed kind of talking about archival neutrality. My advisor was like, oh no, like you don't need to include that. And I was like, well, and in my own experience, I had been at the SAA conference in Austin when the Frank Bowles article To Everything There Is a Season came out, and that whole big controversy. I mean, that was what, 2019? And there's still people that are saying that, like, I mean, clearly that was published. There's still people saying that, you know, an archivist should not assert their ability to be creative and make a socially active decision. And so to me, I mean, even though us that are more in the academic archival world see archival neutrality as a thing of the past, in reality, I don't really think it is. And so, and I work at the Ransom Center. Some of the people that I interviewed came from there, which is kind of a more traditional institution. Some people that I interviewed came from the Benson Latin America collection at UT Austin, and others, another one from the Briscoe History Center. So I got really various responses to that. Most people agreed that, you know, there was some sort of decision making, but the way that they talked about neutrality in some cases was positive. So there was like this idea of like, I'm told to keep things kind of level and neutral, you know, and it's all about a balance. And I had 3 archivists who kind of, that was their mindset. And then but that's not to say that they did not share things and other questions and other conversations that made it very clear that that was not always how they practiced. So it was just a really interesting understanding on how they positioned themselves with archival work. And I'm like super curious and digging more into that, hopefully at some point in like a larger scale. But that was one of the most interesting parts. And then I also noticed that I think one of my questions was like, do you see the work you do as creative? And 3 out of the 6 archivists were very hesitant, almost felt like it reminded me of like imposter syndrome at saying that the work they did was creative. And even though they were talking to me about these active decisions that they made, you know, so that was really interesting. And I want to do more in that realm, but yeah.
That's so fascinating. There's this really great comment from Jennifer in the chat about the fact that maybe the sort of move or emphasis on neutrality is perhaps like a professional distancing, like a strategy, right? In a way to sort of, I mean, I'm not speaking for Jennifer, but like my interpretation of what Jennifer is saying is as a way to protect themselves from perhaps the trauma of working with certain collections. And Jennifer just popped up on the screen. So Jennifer, you want to say a little bit more about it? There's also a question from Wendy Duff in the chat as well that I want to pose to the panelists. But Jennifer, please, if you want to say something more about your comment.
Oh, I don't want to say too much, but I just wanted to share that what Bethany was saying. And I don't know that the archivists that I talked to maybe might not have used the term neutrality, but objectivity or some kind of distance, right? Some kind of professionalism. And in our session on Monday, we talked about some of because we did some very similar interviews, I think, to what Henria and Wendy and Christa are doing. We interviewed archivists about their grief and other emotions in records work, supports that were available to them, that kind of thing. So when we talked on Monday, I didn't talk as much about sort of the professionalism aspect in the sense of how it could be helpful to people that way, more about how people were finding it as sort of a yoke, kind of. But then I also had a couple people contact me after the session to talk about that too, and say, you know, sometimes I find it's easier on me to figure out where I need to be personally involved and where I maintain that professional distance. So it's maybe there's like some different things to unpack around like neutrality and professionalism and distance and strategies, but thinking of how those kinds of things can be strategized through the agency of the archivist is interesting too. So anyway, thanks for your presentations too. They were great.
Thanks, Jennifer. And I just want to recognize that we have about a minute left, but I do want to pose Wendy's question, because it was something I was thinking about as well. Like I was thinking in a much more sort of reductive way, like why affect now? But you know, but Wendy's question, I'll read it really quickly, is the research on empathy, affect, trauma, grief work, and the archives a fundamental shift from previous research, or is this a natural progression from archival theories that have developed over the past 20 years? What are some of our panelists thinking about? Perhaps a very challenging question. In certain ways, it could also be food for thought. But I thought the same thing, like why affect now? You know what I'm saying? In addition to like, you know, it's sort of the way has permeated other disciplines and its introduction to archives by some of the individuals already cited, you know, in the past like 5-6 years or so, like, you know, like why affect now? Like, you know, what role does it have now, right? So I don't know if you want to address that. It is already noon, so I want to respect people's time. So I don't know if that's something that's food for thought as well. There's also a comment from Maya Hirschman that says, I think there's a similar wariness among museum collection workers and unwillingness to say their work is creative, but perhaps that is responsive. This is in response to Bethany's comment about people's unwillingness to view their work as creative. So I don't know if you guys want to take that question really quickly in the last sort of over minute we have. This is already 12:01 here in California, and we could also leave it for food for thought. How do people feel about it?
I definitely don't have the answer, I will just say, so like food for thought, but I think that's a really great question. And I do see like the way that these affect studies that have been kind of emerging over the past like 30 years, there's almost this arc where like archival neutrality and like saying, you know, understandings that, you know, the archives aren't neutral is moving at a similar pace, I feel. So I don't know if it's just, yeah, it is kind of like, why now though? It really is the hot topic. And it's interesting. I mean, I'm really glad to see how many people are talking about this now. It's exciting to me, but yeah, I definitely don't know the answer. So
any final thoughts from the Henria, since you're the one that's left from the Toronto team?
You know, I think there are people here who you know, have been doing that research over the past 20 years, and so they certainly know better. For me, personally, I think that it feels urgent and also not really possible at this point in my life and in, you know, places that we live to not talk about affect and emotions. And so, and that's of course because all of the generative, amazing, like foundational work that was done by, you know, people here that I get to just, you know, build on. But honestly, I don't see another way forward. So I know that lots of people don't feel that way, but that's where I am.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you so much to Christa in absentia. And thank you so much to all of you for attending, for sticking around. Again, the recording will be available on the AERI YouTube channel. And please, you know, feel free to continue the conversation with these wonderful panelists. I see many collaborations happening across institutions in Canada and the US. So please follow up with each other as well. So thank you so much and have a wonderful day. Have a wonderful rest of your AERI. All right, take care, everyone. Bye.